Hey, it's Rob. Welcome back to the Fundraising Bright Spots podcast. And we're here for another episode in which we talk about several different editions of the podcast which we think will help you. I'm joined by my colleague and friend Ben. Ben, how are you?
I'm very good, Rob. Excited for this episode again.
Yeah, so just recently we shared an episode where we talk about 3 or 4 particular episodes which are well worth a listen because they should really help people. And the focus for this one is a little different. If the listener is listening to this in, for example, January of the new year, and they're in a time of reflection and maybe planning of how they want their year to go, I wanted to do something that might help with New Year's resolution type thinking. But because resolutions notoriously tend not to last for most of us and could include kind of one-hit wonder things like, I really want to go to that festival or succeed at that work project, I wanted to be clear that actually, if right now you're doing some thinking about a way of being at work that will help you enjoy succeeding at work, I think the way to approach it is to think in terms of habits rather than necessarily resolutions, because at some level, those might feel more evergreen and long lasting than a resolution. I think, and I've said before on this show, after studying people who raise a lot of money consistently, what they tend to do is they don't just do one action or pitch really well on one day, have one great creative idea. Really, success in fundraising and in life tends to be more of a marathon than a sprint. And if it's some level, I mean, that makes it sound like hard work, but the idea behind that is about consistency. And at its simplest, what I would say after interviewing hundreds of these people, it tends to be repeatedly, consistently, they do certain things each week or sometimes even each day, each of which actually isn't that hard. They're easy to do, but then they're also easy not to do. And that's why for years I've been interested in what are those habits, and therefore what are things we can do, any of us, to emulate those fundraisers and do more of those habits in our ongoing approach to work.
I totally agree, Rob. And I think some of the people listening to this, maybe they'll hear a new habit backed up with a cool story from perhaps an ex-podcast guest, or maybe it's a habit that they know they should do, and it's the story today that will help them be more like, do you know what, I'm just going to give this a go and get the payoff. So yeah, listener, look for the balance of both the habit and also some cool stories and examples, or even extra podcasts you could listen to help you be most likely to actually give this a go, because everything we've seen is it will pay you back.
Yeah. And so the first one I recommend you at least try, if you're not already trying it, is decide what you want. And in brackets, ideally also make that visual. How could we be more likely to notice things that would help us get our fundraising result? That's the key question. And I would say evoke your reticular activating system by precisely deciding what things you want to happen. And to move this beyond the level of a kind of a banal tweet, maybe you can tune in to how your reticular activating system is a bit of your brain that developed in our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago to help them pay attention to a particular source of food that would help them live, or a source of food that they should avoid, or a particular sign that there's a predator out there that you really need to go into fight or flight mode to avoid. Those ancestors survived because they got good at paying attention to those cues, more important than the other 99 things going on at the moment. The modern day version of this, maybe our listener will recognize, is if you've ever got back from having bought a new car or a particular new coat, for example, and then for the next few days, you notice several other people driving exactly that same model and color of car, or with exactly the same coat as you. If you've ever noticed this, you might have thought, what's happened? Like, is everyone copying me? The truth is, those cars or coats were always there, just as commonly as they are now. It's just before you got one, you weren't paying attention. That's what's going on. And that's your brain paying attention to things that are now meaningful to you. So How do we apply this insight to help us in our fundraising? Well, it varies depending on what kind of fundraising you do. But for instance, if you're a corporate fundraiser, rather than solely have a long list on a spreadsheet of the 98 companies that possibly could be interested in supporting because at some point they've given £100 or £1,000, if you've got relatively little time for new business effort, we recommend you just somehow find a way to focus your attention on just 10 or 12 of them. It doesn't mean those are the only 10 or 12 you'll accept money from. It does mean it's so precious your time to be proactively seeking relationships with a few companies. The act of deciding those 10 or 12 companies, who they are, step one, so that your RAS starts to overhear conversations about that or to notice LinkedIn posts about that company or what have you. And then secondly, even I would say, make it visual. So people who attend our corporate mastery after day one and doing this process, they put the 10 or 12 logos on a single piece of paper. It's a bit like a wanted poster, not to plaster all over social media, because that probably would be weird, but on your own notice board, and maybe share with your colleagues, I'm looking for a conversation with one of these companies. You don't know anyone, do you? And now both you are more likely to notice people that you know, you're linked in with, who work at that company or who are posting about that company. And also, if you put it on your notice board or you share it when you meet someone who cares about your charity and you say, do you know anyone in any of these companies that you could introduce me to? For years and years, we found this gives you a massive advantage in not getting immediate money, but just getting a first conversation and starting to build a relationship with one of those companies.
I love this, Rob, and know it has helped me and countless others. Rob, is there any more detail on how you might actually do this?
Yeah, my top tip really, if you're intrigued by the idea but want a bit of an encouragement, would be to listen to episode 171 of our podcast. It's called Growing Existing Partnerships and Winning New Ones. It's with a brilliant fundraiser called Charlie Richardson from a great charity called Medical Detection Dogs. And she came on our corporate mastery program a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And after day one, she went back, she did this work, and she created her little poster, and she put it on her notice board, and she put it on her phone. And in the episode of the podcast, she tells this story of, I don't know, a couple of weeks after doing that, her colleague coming to talk to her at her desk, seeing the poster on her notice board and saying, what are these companies? Are they your partners? And her saying, no, those are companies I'd love a conversation with because for various reasons, they would be great partners. And her colleague saying, you're kidding, like that one? I used to work there for 12 years. I've got loads of mates still there. Is that useful to you? Anyway, long story short, within 4 or 5 months, that company had nominated this charity to be Charity of the Year and won a landslide vote in the internal vote for that. And the partnership, I think, is worth at least £100,000 with a car company in the hometown of Charlie's charity. And it's so clear that that would not have happened had she not decided which ones were on her list and gone the extra step of making it visual. And other success stories, it's not even necessarily your colleague noticing a relationship. It's just the act of you deciding makes you more intentional to follow up and do sometimes small things to somehow get that first conversation with the company.
I love it, Rob. Last week, I was delivering a training sessions, over 20 people in a room. And after describing this technique, this Dream 10, more visual goals, someone called Nicola, totally unprompted, just stood up and said, I first learnt about this from Rob maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I did create a Dream 10 and it felt a bit uncomfortable at the time because I just, gosh, some of these feel impossible, but I'm going to put it on there anyway. And she said, and I couldn't believe it. 18 months later, 3 of the biggest ones, including a £140,000 Charity of the Year partnership for a company that they had never been shortlisted with before. They never thought they were going to win. They'd won this partnership. Another one of the biggest well-known companies in their local area. She said, I was standing on the beach, got a phone call from this company to say that they'd like to partner with us. She said, I was in tears on this beach. And she just said, do you know, it came down to, I put those logos on this piece of paper. It was next to me. It was in my conversations. It was everywhere. I couldn't have believed in 2 years' time just the impact that had happened. And Nicola is not a one-off. This is something that I hear an awful lot, that I used in my career. I totally agree, Rob. Help yourself, get your own Dream 10, your visual goal. And like you said earlier, even if it isn't companies, I've done this in a room with people who say, well, actually, Ben, I've got 35 schools in my local area that I could be partnering with. We ask, are all 35 equal? Could some of them raise you more money? Are some of them more valuable? Well, actually, yes, Ben, there's 3 that are more valuable. There's these 2 public schools and then this one much larger academy. Put the schools on there, like put the local Freemasons group on there, put the golf club that raises more than others. The act of putting it on will help prime your brain and with other tangible habits to help you. What a brilliant habit to start with, Rob.
Thanks, Ben. So the habit is get clear, decide what you want, and make it visual. Ben, what's another habit?
Do you know, I think this habit leads on perfectly after your one. This habit is all about, once I am clear on the type of supporter, donor, company, trusts, foundation, then the habit I'd like you to get into is twofold. One of them is seek conversations with that sort of person. Conversations, not gifts yet. Seek conversations. On our courses, we call it test drives. And do that crucially with what I describe as the power habit of picking up the phone. Using your phone to be more likely to invite them to an event or to check if they are going to attend the event. Use the phone to understand why they chose to start supporting your charity. Use the phone to talk to a trustee of yours or someone who's well networked in the local area just to seek their advice. Use the phone, use the phone, use the phone. Now, I'm aware that actually, Rob, every year that goes by, people are less and less likely to use their smartphone device to actually call people. I'm aware that it's a habit that seems to be disappearing. And in fact, if you're interested, if you were seeing a graph of the likelihood for people to use the phone, after the pandemic, it dropped like off of a cliff for a whole host of reasons. And one of them is, in all honesty, when I talk to people, when we receive phone calls out of the blue, they're not often from people who are as caring and emotionally intelligent as most fundraisers. And so my initial reference, or the evidence I've got for what it's like to receive a phone call out of the blue, isn't overwhelmingly positive. And I understand and appreciate that and see why that, plus other reasons, might be getting in the way of picking up the phone. But what fascinates me is that when I shift that perspective away from picking up the phone is a pushy thing to do, picking up the phone is me taking, picking up the phone is me interrupting their day, to noticing times when people have picked up the phone, talked to someone, and it's made their life better. And I think in particular of someone called Martha, who I worked with just over 2 years ago now. And she said she was a bit afraid of picking up the phone. She didn't like picking up the phone. After a few little steps to just guide her into being more likely to pick up the phone. One of them, Rob, a nice question I'd like to ask, is there anyone who has supported your charity in the last few weeks, months, an event that they've attended, where you could just call them to say thank you? Martha tried a couple of steps to call someone who she was struggling to get more conversations with, to call them to just understand a bit more about why they thought of her charity in the first place. And honestly, Rob, 6 weeks after making those phone calls on day 2 of a training course, she said, I love the phone. Because this habit that she's got into now is using the phone when she needs to speak to colleagues internally, using the phone when she's got a question for one of her current accounts, or when she needs to feed back something, using the phone to understand why someone has started supporting them. And she's found that it's helped companies be more likely to support her. It's helped her colleagues to understand why she's asking questions. She's actually, Rob, in those 2 years, by the way, been promoted twice. If I were listening to this podcast and I did still feel a bit apprehensive about picking up the phone, then for a calmer, more detailed conversation, I think I'd encourage you to look through episode 178, which is all about this power habit and little things you can do. I think I give 3 or 4 tips that you can do, or that you can encourage people in your team to do, to help with your confidence picking up the phone. And Rob, I know this is, a blend of things we've learned and you've learned from delivering the mastery course, but you've noticed a shift in this habit does have quite the impact on people's belief and results.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'm just going to add to what you've already said. The starting point is not the phone is the answer to everything. The starting point is if only I could get more conversations with the right kind of supporters. That's the starting point. Actually, there are other things you can do that increase your chances of getting that conversation. So the phone isn't the catch-all, save-all. It's just that we've noticed once you get really good at it, you discover it does make a wonderful difference in achieving that other outcome. But it's not the only way. And I know you said that, but I want to reiterate it to people rather than seeking money as the primary goal. And the second thing, literally 6 weeks ago, a wonderful fundraiser called Debbie on our Major Gifts Mastery, she just shared on our WhatsApp that she called up a donor who was giving £500 a month, not to ask for anything, but just to say thank you. It's making a wonderful difference. And he was so surprised to receive a lovely, thoughtful call with no strings attached that immediately he changed his donation from 500 to 1,000. So he doubled his regular gift. So that charity is now not receiving £6,000 per year ongoingly, but they're receiving £12,000 per year. And this was literally a 3 or 4 minute conversation. And I want the listener to understand that potentially Debbie and most other human beings I know would have had a voice in our head before deciding to pick up the phone that sounded reasonable to persuade her not to bother. And of all the downsides, like you said, some of the things that go through our head, she took a deep breath and did it anyway. And we're not saying that every call you make, because that's the point, you're not calling on most of the time to ask for money. Not every call will double your money. Lots of them won't in the short term actually generate more money, but they have all these other wonderful benefits, steps along the way to deepening relationships with people who care about our cause.
Yeah, and I can think of people who immediately after learning this, they'd had lots of people do fundraising events for them. They decided to call the 20 who'd raised the most amount of money just to say thank you and to let them know you've raised an extraordinary amount of money. And in that one phone call, somebody pledged £3,000 there and then to try and raise more next year. Another person who called a company who was thinking about giving a donation to them at Christmas. In fact, they were thinking about giving them about, I think, £2,000 to £5,000. And because of the phone call to this company, the company 2 days later gave them £50,000. And their feedback was, we had told 10 charities that we were thinking of supporting them this Christmas. You were the only one to pick up the phone. Her name was Pam. Pam did not pick up the phone to ask for money or to get something. She just picked up the phone to understand them a bit more. So did the fundraiser Beverly, who was calling her highest event fundraisers. Sometimes it is a lovely conversation. I like the way that Leanne, I think, described it to me. If I don't pick up the phone, then these names of people who give to us are ultimately, Ben, just size 12 Arial font on a spreadsheet, and they seem these black and white names and I don't have anything to them. She said the moment I pick up the phone and understand a bit more about them, suddenly there is colour and light and a story and a reason and a face and an image, and that's what I think of when I see the name. And that makes me more likely to invite them to an event or to send them a thank you card or to deepen the relationship or to talk to them about something. And I love the way she framed it. It goes from a black and white size 12 Arial font to the story of who this person is. And I can imagine that.
Hey, it's Rob, and I'm super excited to let you know that my favourite masterclass, Wow Your Donors, is back. It's happening in London on the 4th of Feb, 2026. If you like this podcast, or if you've ever found my webinars or our Bright Spot training helpful, I promise you will love the Wow Your Donors Masterclass 2026. The ideas we share are designed to help every fundraising discipline. To give you a sense of it, here's Laura Elliott, Head of Supporter Fundraising at Rennie Grove Peace Hospice, who took part last year.
It was really inspirational to be in a room with people from across the country at all different levels and stages and departments within fundraising, and to feed off that energy and that excitement and the ideas that were shared on the day. It also helped me to go away to work on the concept of personalising our approach even further, particularly with our event participants, to now see some of the great success that we're experiencing this year.
If you want to feel inspired like Laura, secure your place today before it sells out. If you're quick, you'll benefit from the early bird discount, which saves you £100. Find out more and book your place at brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. I look forward to meeting you at Wow Your Donors 2026.
Rob, I think there is at least one more habit that can help you this year. What would you say it is?
Sure. Well, I think this one is kind of obvious in a way, and it might be a thing that many of our listeners are kind of intending to do or want to get better at. But if you're like me, throughout my career, there's times when I've really struggled with this thing because I just get so busy doing stuff. And the habit is this year, quite deliberately build the habit of making time to think. And if you want some help, because it's not always easy, because your to-do list is so long and overwhelming, and you've got this sense of, I just got to get the stuff done. They need the stuff back. I really recommend you might listen to the podcast episode we recorded. It's episode 170 with the brilliant Jumar Johnson. And a bit of context is that for years I've followed Jumar's career and always been a bit in awe of the things she achieves. At the time when she came to speak at our Breakfast Club for Fundraisers, she was the Chief of Staff to the Vice Chancellor of the Open University, which is a massive job, huge responsibility. And also a whole nother job she did for that organisation at the same time was she was the development director. And Jumar's a coach and a consultant, and she does public speaking and a busy mum and all other kinds of busy things in her home life. And yet every time I've spoken to Jumar over the years, she never seems flustered and overwhelmed by it all. She's always seemed relatively relaxed, sure, busy, but enjoying the challenge of all these responsibilities. And one time I asked her, how on earth do you cope and get all that stuff done, like several jobs in one that would overwhelm most of us? I was speaking for myself. And she said, honestly, it's this thing that my mentor at the Open University taught me years ago, which is the quite conscious, deliberate act of building in more thinking time per day and per week than I had been doing at the moment.
Gosh, I am impressed, Rob, that a habit you've said is for us to build in more thinking time into our day. But I can totally hear the listener saying, how? I've just got enough time to listen to the podcast, Rob. What's the advice? What was coming through on that chat with Jumar? What would you say?
Okay, so broadly a couple of things. Of course, I recommend you get the whole experience of hearing Jumar explain it her way. But as the interviewer, here's a couple of my tips. One is, at its simplest, early in the day, rather than rush straight to your first reply to those emails to get them out of my inbox. Before you do anything else, a habit I recommend you test, even if it's literally for 5 to 10 minutes per morning before you actually do anything or reply to anyone, some thinking time each morning about what would be great outcomes for today. Because of course there's dozens of things people are asking you to do, but from your point of view of what you're responsible for, what are 2, 3, 4 most valuable things, projects, outcomes you would like to move forward, so that if you are able to stop work at 5 o'clock, for example, if those 3 or 4 things were done, definitely you would feel I had a productive day, because important things are moving in the right direction. And as obvious as that sounds, if we don't pause before we start doing stuff, we might not get really clear on what those 3 things are. And we might end up, weirdly, doing activity which doesn't serve any of those 3 things, which is why we might get to 5 o'clock with this sense of, oh, I'm really treading water, or it's a Sisyphean task that's never going to end, and I don't think the important things have moved forward. So A, it gives you greater clarity on what they are, and B, it often gives you greater insight as to the most effective way of doing them, because some of the things others are asking of you, or that are in your inbox or your default to-do list, might not be the best way of getting to that outcome. Linking back to your previous point, sometimes just picking up the phone to that key internal colleague, or quite deliberately seeking a conversation with them rather than trying to solve things, get information by email, for instance, could absolutely shortcut a project or radically increase the quality, for instance, of the information that would help you win that pitch or solve that internal problem, for instance.
I know, Rob, when you had talked to me about this previously, you said that time gives you a chance to prime your brain, because your brain is incredibly powerful if the right question is posed. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jumar talks about this, and also in my recent conversation for the podcast with Julian Cailloet Noble from the Sustainable Restaurants Association, that organisation has had to deal with amazing turmoil in its environment, the restaurant sector, over the last 5 years, for all kinds of reasons our listeners can imagine. And yet, Julian tells how her organisation, I mean, it hasn't been plain sailing. It's been extremely difficult, but they have managed to stay relatively nimble and agile and change their strategy and keep adapting to be able to get to a point now where absolutely there are really strong partnerships. Income is at its highest it's ever been, and the future looks as rosy as it ever has. And in the episode, Julian talks about various strategic shifts they've made, including diversifying the partners they go after and build partnerships with. But the punchline to lots of it, I think, is late in the conversation where she says, do you know, I asked myself the question, or I asked my team the question, rather than do it that way we were going to, or that's worked for us in the past, is there a better way? Is there a different way to still get this outcome which we need? And she also says, and often asking that question, even if initially you don't know the answer, but nevertheless asking it of yourself or others expectantly, it's amazing how sooner or later you discover there is a better way, often a way that's so much more elegant and powerful than the way we would have done it. I never realized this, but actually what is thinking, I now realize, is not just sit down and meditate. Thinking is asking yourself a good question. And in a relaxed way, maybe with a pen in your hand, maybe go for a walk. But if you keep asking useful questions, the right questions that serve effective mission and fundraising, doing that more often like Jumar does, A, each morning, and B, in advance of any meeting you do, any important meeting, thinking, who's it with? What outcome would I like for them and us? Even just 2 minutes, or sometimes much longer for a really important meeting, the act of thinking more rather than primarily doing, reacting, that would be the habit I recommend people really practice more of, and notice whether it is paying you back for the extra time you invested in it. And like I say, if you want encouragement, it's episode 170 with Jumar. Okay, Ben. If there was one more habit you really think would be valuable for people to consider trying, what would it be?
Do you know, for me, Rob, it is deliberately trying to find the leverage point. The leverage point. So to put it in perspective, I think many of our listeners have a juicy challenge that might keep them awake at night, some big, some small, over the course of this year and next year. And I want them to imagine that challenge a bit like a boulder. So for instance, I love the podcast episode that you did with Craig Linton on finding more leverage points. So I think it's episode 179. If we imagine that a boulder is something like patchy individual giving income, there's lots of different things you might initially think might be able to move this big, ugly, heavy boulder. And you might try lots of stuff and it barely moves. The leverage point principle says one or two things have disproportionate weight and likely and vantage point. If you imagine a lever underneath a boulder, disproportionately more likely to get it to move. So if I think of patchy individual giving income, then Craig talks about, you know, one of the most powerful leverage points is your thank you process. Put more specifically, how quickly can we thank someone after they've donated? On the pod, he talks about a range of different studies, Rob, that have shown the difference between if I thank someone within 48 hours versus if it can take longer than that, even up to 3 weeks, and the difference in the likelihood for them to give again, to give more amounts. Like when I'm imagining this leverage point, the speed of my thank you is actually one of them. Out of everything I could change, I'd pick that. Not the copy, not the image, not the website, the speed of which I could send a thank you.
Great. And the truth is, often it's not easy to know which of the many places we could push to try to move this problem are going to be much more valuable and worthy of our effort than the others. But the act of at least asking that question and trying to work it out in and of itself is a valuable habit. And sooner or later, you will start to notice that some effort you put in is much more valuable than the rest. Ben, in that example, Craig does share some interesting things he discovered once he went deeper because he decided that this is worth the effort.
Yeah, so once you've made a choice on what the boulder is and then you're trying to find the leverage point, I like this. One of the things he said was, in the book they call it walking the floor, but he had a look at what the actual process was. And for instance, for many organisations that he's worked with, and he was thinking, I think, over 40 in 1 year, he said their thank you process was linear, almost based on the historical way we used to bank money. So he said the check clearing process, he said, it's almost this linear journey. The check comes in, it gets sent to the bank. Only after that's been done do the finance team start to raise the fact that you need a thank you. The thank you gets sent to supporter care. The letter then gets produced. And anything from 3 days to 3 weeks goes past before we send them a thank you. And when he looked at that process, he said, why is this happening?
And that process is still there, even though nowadays relatively few donations are in the form of a cheque.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the weird thing. It was a hangover from the time that we used to use cheques. And what it meant was charities were waiting to thank people because they were worried the cheque might bounce. The money might not make it into the bank account. Now, a couple of things. He said back in the day when we did used to give cheques, hardly any used to bounce anyway. Out of about 1,000 donations, 3 or 4 used to bounce. So already there's a system that's being made for the 3 out of 1,000 rather than the 997 out of 1,000. But he said nowadays that isn't a problem we need to worry about. So suddenly, what if we were to thank someone almost immediately from the moment that they've given? And I think he said in the studies that a thank you within 24 or 48 hours, even a phone call, can have this dramatic impact on someone's giving, even a 60% increase. Now, all of these, I think, are clues that this is a leverage point. This is something that we should put time and energy in. One of the things that Craig talks about to solve this is rather than each team and each process happening one after another, the question was, what if they happened all at the same time so that we could speed this up? And he said the outcomes of this, well, he's got it. I mean, listen to the episode 179, because he'll talk about the impact that it's had on charities' income and on their giving. And so for me, I think all of us have a particular challenge, big or small, where the right focus and the right area can create this leverage point and make a massive shift.
Yeah. And it is really compelling. Craig says he's done this process in 4 or 5 different charities, and where before it was taking on average 2 or 3 weeks for thank yous to all get out there. Every time he's done this process, they reduce it to people being thanked within 48 hours, and almost without exception. When you link that back to the effect it has on people feeling valued and therefore staying more loyal and more generous to the charity, you can see what an amazing difference this makes.
I totally agree, Rob. And to be clear, I'm not saying your habit should be change your thank you process unless you think that's your boulder and leverage point. I'm saying in everything we do, there is something that it's worth finding that leverage point for. So, for instance, Rob, we talk a lot on our corporate and major gift mastery about the leverage point of how many conversations am I getting in with exactly the sort of people who are either connected to the companies we want to win a partnership with or the sorts of donors. But the leverage point is how often am I focusing on and doing things to get more coffees, more conversations, more drip feeding of things that deepen a relationship. And for lots of other episodes, you can look at ways to create your leverage point there. But I think for each one of you, if you look at yourself or your team, there will be something that it's worth putting that disproportionate focus on. It will pay you back.
Yeah. And what's interesting is this is a 2-step process. There's 2 halves to this. Step 1, be really curious and try to find the leverage point. You're already ahead if you can get clearer on that than many fundraisers are. But secondly, we're not saying it's not hard work. Craig would be the first to say that actually it took some problem solving, some hard conversations, some creativity and some effort and some discipline to keep going even when something seemed to be a brick wall. It's still hard work to solve the thing, but what we have found is once you're clearer that it is a leverage point, it does become easier to keep going and doing the hard yards to actually get this over the line and start to get the massive uplift.
Yeah. So, Rob, for our listener, what would you say are the 4 habits they can do to help them this year?
Okay, so I'm not saying these are the only valuable habits for fundraisers and fundraising leaders. And I'm not saying you're not already doing some of these, but my recommendation across the next year is if you want to increase fundraising income and enjoy your job, you might consider trying at least one or two of these 4. To run through it again, one was decide what you want clearly and even make it visible, create some kind of visual reminder for you, like for instance, the Dream 10 process we teach on Corporate Partnerships Mastery. Secondly, pick up the phone and or do other things to somehow get conversations. More conversations can only help deepen relationships with the kind of people who care about your cause. Thirdly, as Jumar Johnson suggests, deliberately make more time to think. And fourthly, find the leverage point. Yes, within a large, difficult, seemingly immovable but difficult problem to solve, but also across a day in any different process, ask yourself, what is the leverage point? Is there an easier way of doing this? How could I apply force to a particular bit of this challenge that's more likely to get the result? So those are the 4. Best of luck trying them out. Do let us know how you get on. As always, Ben and I are so pleased to hear your feedback, and especially if you've got little examples of when these kinds of ideas are paying off for you. We're always so pleased to get your messages either via the Bright Spot website or via LinkedIn. Thank you as ever for listening and for supporting our podcast. We do really appreciate it. Have a wonderful year, and we look forward to sharing more Bright Spot stories with you very soon.